Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Welcome to Turbonomic Labs on this fine Thursday. My name is Eric Wright. I am your host here. Oh, there we go. That's me. I'm Eric Wright. I'm at Disco Posse if you want to follow along on Twitter and keep up with all of the crazy exploits that we do here along with my Turbonomic team. Today is our Thursday event, and our Thursdays for Turbonomic Labs are about open technologies and using just anything that's literally, IT ecosystem and IT ops and DevOps and stuff that's going to be important to you in how you can interact with your tools, your infrastructure, and your resources in a variety of different ways. Having come from a background in running IT operations teams and being part of development support, it's important that I wanted to make sure that I can give you my sense of where things are at when it comes to doing stuff like PowerShell and those kinds of things. Now, the trick with PowerShell and PowerCLI are two veins of how we interact with VMware ecosystems, which I easy to bet that they're sort of the dominant hypervisor player in the marketplace. And a lot of their platforms are actually exposed through command line endpoints and API endpoints. So PowerShell, I've been a user of PowerShell for decades at this point, it feels like, because I've been using it in the Microsoft ecosystem for as long as it's been around. So shout out to all the amazing folks that created this, the Jeff Hicks and the Jeff Snovers of the world who've really turned PowerShell into the formative way in which we can build and interact with infrastructure and resources. Now, the choice I've made today is I want to show you how to use just PowerShell to interact with your VMware vCenter API. And one of the most common hooks that people get stuck on is getting authenticated. Now, you could use PowerCLI, which is the VMware derivative. It's also open sourced, so you can actually easily download it, deploy it on lots of different platforms. I'm going to be running off OS X, so I've already got my PowerShell installed. But I don't want to use PowerCLI because imagine that I'm in a world where I don't want to add on extra layers because what we're going to show you just happens to be a vCenter API authentication process. But what we're going to do is you could use this for any API endpoints. So PowerCLI isn't what you want to use. We want to just say completely pure using the core PowerShell features. And also, for folks that want to play along, or if you're just catching up and you're watching this on replay, you can see all of the code that we're going to be building because I've actually got it hosted up on the Turbonomic Labs GitHub. So if you go to github.com/Turbonomic Labs, then what you're going to see is a few different repositories, and I've got a PowerShell's examples area here. And it's lightly documented at the moment because we're literally just building this live, and I wanted to show the very specific example. So we've got PowerShell samples. We'll have the link to the actual live show as well. So you can, if you're discovering us through that side of the world, it's easy to link back and show what's going on. So we've got two different ways in which we're going to interact. Number one is I want to do this, say, interactively. So imagine that I've got a command line and I want it to prompt me for credentials in order to securely pass them. And so it uses the credentials object inside PowerShell in order to convert it to base64 and then pass it through so that it's effectively, obscured in transit. I'm assuming that you're going to be running this from within your environments versus over the air. However, that's why we want to make sure that we're using the credentials object so that it's not passing in the clear just as a straight basic auth in the URL, because you can do that. It works. Not really a terribly good idea. And then the second way we're going to do this is using this, what we call the env auth, in which I've defined my credentials locally in my environment. And this is if you think of 12-factor app, using environment variables to define certain features and areas of operations, this is the way to do it. So keep your environment localized And this means that I can go through, and I've created, in this case, an exports file for Mac. We could create a batch file as well for Windows, which I should do. And if we take a look at the example in this exports file, it is literally just 3 environment variables that we're going to use, which is VC user, VC pass, and VC server. So you're going to store these ones locally. It's running from your machine, so you should be fairly safe. Again, ideally, we should go one step further and use a vault or use something else, but we needed to start with baby steps. So the process we're going to go through today is we're going to first run our export file. So we're loading our variables into our local environment. We're all going to do this all through the command line. I'll walk you through exactly the thing. And then I'm going to show you in the different flow of this PowerShell script how we're actually getting a token from so first authenticating to vCenter, getting a token, taking that token and passing it in order to then from that point on generate RESTful API calls using the invoke REST method, as well as the, I'll just show you what's going on here. Let's open one up. So you can use Invoke Web Request, and you can also use the REST method. So we've got a couple of different ways to tackle it, and we're going to walk through this. So I'm going to just step through, and we're going to see exactly what goes on as we do this process. So the first thing we're going to do is we need to be able to set your vCenter object. So because I've gone ahead and I'm going to run my exports. So I'm going to now enter my PowerShell. Now remember, you have to actually, because of the way the PowerShell works, you have to load the environment first and then spawn your PowerShell. Because if you try to run your exports file, you're in PowerShell mode. You're not actually running your bash script. So there are ways to do it, but I wanted to simplify it and say that I've already loaded. And if I were to take this command, so I'm going to go through literally just quickly, line by line, what's it look like? So I'm going to take assign a vCenter variable. It uses the get child item from the environment, looking for the vCenter pair. So it's like a key value pair, and I'm only going to grab the value. It comes back with nothing, of course, because it's actually done is loaded into the variable. So if I just type in vCenter as a $sign, I basically export, or I could do a write host vCenter. You're going to now see the value which has been loaded from the environment variable. That's it. So why do we do this? We don't want to load code into our script, because you'll notice that this is completely reference free. There's no URLs, there's no passwords, no usernames that you have to replace. All of your work happens just in your environment variable, or you can do it through the interactive get credentials. So here, now we're going to set our environment URL, and this is for setting the session URL and where we're going to actually go to push our authentication and get a token back. So it's taking the variable, loading it into, and ultimately just tacking on the back end of it, which is the /rest/com. So this is the interactive session area. So you're now going to go through, and why we do this is because when you load your session, you get a token, and that token lasts for a period of time. You really don't want to do it as like a long-term token and then paste your token in all over the place. Again, it's very poor, it's not repeatable, and it's not secure. So what we want to do is every single time you spawn this process, you should go get a new token. That token then gets passed into the subsequent URLs and values that we need to push through. Now, the next one here, this is the interactive one. So we're going to say assign a credential using the get credential commandlet. And then we're going to take the results of this, and we're then going to parse the username and password. We're going to convert that into a base 64 string. And then we're going to set this as the encoded basic credential that we're now going to pass into the URL. Now, if you've done this with curl, and we could take a look in they've got lots of examples on your vCenter API of like how to do certain things, and they typically will show you, what is this is not the interactive one, but they'll say like, what does it look like? And they'll give you the curl command. So we curl -x, set the header, so you can go through your interactive API example and be able to see it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to log in because, as always happens, my VPN drops right in the middle of this. So now if I go to my vCenter, and in fact here, let's actually just do this. Oops. Down here, you've got this browse REST APIs. And what you're doing is you can actually just browse the API, or in this case, you can also hit the login so you can actually authenticate to it. So you can choose the different ways in which you want to interact. So if we look at the how to get a session, this is showing you how to create a session. So effectively they're giving you, but you've got to do this JSON payload. It's a whole scene. We want to cut down on the need to do that. So we're not going to build all these JSON files and build all these URLs and then store them and then load them. It's all being done through easy commandlet usage. So what we've done, we get our credentials, we've assigned it, put it into an encoded header under authorization. And now what we're going to do is we're going to invoke web request, sending it to this URI, which is the URL that we've created here. Is my vCenter URL. And I'm saying using it's a post because you have to send a post request, grab the headers. And in this case here, I put this in for ease of use because a lot of folks are using self-signed certificates. So when you go to run this, if you don't have a skip certificate check, you have to load the certificate, authorize it, store that locally. So this is a way, again, not the best practice really, because you want to make sure that you're ultimately should have a secure cert, whether it's internal or external, but self-signed certs will fail. If you try and do anything with this, it'll come back saying invalid certificate, doesn't match the object. So we're going to get a token result, which comes back with, again, a JSON reply, which now that it does this, it's going to say, here's your content and your value. So we're going to take this and we're going to grab the value, convert it from JSON. And then from there, now what we're going to do is we're going to set a session token, and the name of this that we're going to pass into the next header is this token. So get a token, or request a token, get a JSON result. Parse out simply the token value that you need, set it as a token in a header for the session. And then now you can even, I've got it here so you can actually uncomment these and you can see them on the fly. And we'll step through this in a moment. And then now what I'm going to do is I'm setting my virtual machine URL. So say I want to query a virtual machine. I just gave this as a simple example. I'm going to go through and assign, again, completely based on my environment that I've configured. And it just goes to the RESTful API endpoint for a VM. And then we're going to set a variable, which is going to be a result from going to this URL, passing this through, and ultimately gets back a result, which then from there, you can parse it out. You can do other things with, and we'll just write it to the console. Okay, so let's just walk through this. So pardon me, we're going to cut and paste as we go here. So we've actually done this, but we'll repeat it for the purposes of joy. So again, we're going to say that we want to confirm that we have our vCenter. Okay, cool. We're loaded. We're going to define the session for the URL. Okay, and if I go through, let's check our work. Okay, so you can see it's added in the vCenter that I've used in my particular environment. It's defined my URL, so life is good. Now what we're going to do is we're going to get the credential, and this is kind of cool. Check this out. You just say get credential. It's going to ask you for a username password combination. So I'm going to give mine, and you want to use your username at domain name, whether that's an Active Directory one or if it's your local vSphere. So it could be like vSphere.local. In this case, I've actually got it using an Active Directory credential. So you don't want to use the backslash, which can be like the classic NetBIOS name style. So domain name / username. And the reason is because the backslash, when you try and use it programmatically, sometimes it actually is an escape character. So we're going to set this. We're going to type in our password. So the cool thing is you can see here, this is actually securely gathering this information from the CLI. And now I'm going to actually convert this and then define my header object. Okay. So I can double check my work again. So what I've got is now a base64 encoded result for my authentication. So I'm not sending credentials in the clear. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and we're going to get our token result, which means we want to actually go. We're going to pass it to the session URL. Okay, so we've got something here. Let's again. Okay, so the token result that comes back, there's lots of content that's in here, but all I care about is this one, which is so you can actually show all the raw content. There's a lot of other data you can gather, but I just need the content and I need the value. So in that key value pair, this is the token that I'm getting, which is now an active token. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to set a token. And if I look at that, my token is now just that object. So it's easy to parse that out programmatically. You can see why this is frustrating for people when they're trying to do this interactively with an API. It's great if you're using Swagger and it works, but what if you want to do this stuff programmatically and repeatedly? You would then have to go get a token, it's Swagger UI, or a lot of people use Postman as an example. We're going to lean in close, folks. I'm going to tell you a secret. No one uses Postman in production. But Postman is great because it is a GUI sort of format for doing some of the stuff and packaging it together. But what it doesn't do is allow you to do this programmatically using scripts and sending it into other infrastructure as code tools. So we've got our token. Now we're going to go ahead and we're going to set the session, which will again be part of the header that we do next time. So we here again, like I can uncomment these if I wanted to show them on the fly, if you're watching this interactively, but we just did that very literally. We're going to set our VM API endpoint URL. So if I do vCenter VM URL, okay, so you can see it's the /rest/vCenter/VM. You can grab that again. Like I said, just go to your API Explorer. You can see all of the different endpoints for vCenter. So you can see data center, data store, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so now we've got our vCenter VM URL. Next piece. Whew, all right. It seems like it's a lot of detail, but the good thing is that this is scripted. So let's go ahead and we're going to do this next piece. We're going to gather the results. So we're going to query. We're going to set it as a variable. Hey, look at that. Okay, so we've got a result. And look at that. The first object that came back. Here's the name of it. So there's in the content is now a JSON result, which you can then go through and ultimately parse it out. It includes the memory. It includes the virtual machine name. This is really handy for programmatic use if you're doing other things, because you cannot necessarily use the name, because you can have 5 machines with the same name, but the underlying VM name is different, especially if you're using vApps and such. So you now can programmatically go through the same way we did before, where we grabbed the token. You could ultimately just say, convert from JSON. This is going to be VM results.content.value. And we could now deal with that. And so there you go. You've actually gone through this full process of interacting, building your URL, interacting with the API in order to authenticate securely, gather a token, use that token to pass it now into an API endpoint request, all done with a RESTful web API. So you didn't need any special installations. All you needed was PowerShell. So any Windows server, any Windows workstation, or even any non-Windows machine with PowerShell installed can initiate this process. And then if you wanted to run it just as one single session here, you could say, what's the name that we called it? Sorry, I should know my own file names. There you go, vccli auth. vccli. I've created it as a PS1 file so it can run natively. Same thing, let's go through it. Hopefully I typed this right. Now it's gone through all of those steps for me in a second. Pretty cool. And now from here, you could ultimately take this and you could do anything with it. The other advantage is if you're using stuff like .NET or VB.NET or any kind of programming interactively, is you can use a lot of the same structure and these same command formats for use in order to interact with it and create like a web front end where you can ultimately query things. And I've used the same URL formatting for Ruby. And so again, as long as you know how to build those URLs, you can then go to Python, you can go to Ruby, you can do all these things and ultimately just make a RESTful API call, because you now know the processes of getting a session, authenticating, getting a session token, taking the token and passing it through to your RESTful API endpoint. So technically I could go through and I could run like 20 different requests because my token is still active. However, you don't want that to be the case, right? You want it to just make sure that it's always fresh. So by running it as a script now, you're completely guaranteeing that you're getting a fresh token. You don't have to worry about the expiry because it's going to always generate a brand new token with no interaction at all other than your password. So that's cool, but that's interactive. If you're going to do this stuff through any kind of other scripting or infrastructure as code, you can't have that. So what you need to be able to do is to be able to do things like go through, do the same thing, but now we're going to show you what it looks like when you use your environment variables in order to pull your credentials. Now, again, one would argue, as they should, that you are storing clear text password in your environment. So technically, there are ways in which other tools could gather it, but it's this session, this shell, it's not loaded globally. So this is why you want to always use, generate a file. And there's other ways. You could really ultimately have a vault. So if you're using like HashiCorp's Vault or some other API accessible endpoint, you could query for credentials, load them in, and do the same thing, all programmatically. Okay, so first step, we set our vCenter. Next one, we set the URL. I mean, technically this stuff should still be around, but we probably flushed it because we ran the script. Now, this is where the difference is. We're going to set the user based on the environment variable, and I'll show you what it looks like. My user was stored in an environment variable. You can see it right there. So that's being stored now. we've got a password setting, which we are going to then convert it and encode it in base 64. And it's actually held now as a secure string, so you can't get it. We're then going to do the authentication. So we're going to use that non-interactively build your credential set. We do the same thing that we did last time, where we're going to now set this and put it in for a basic authorization token. That our basic authorization encoded header. Now we're going to go through and we're going to get our token result. Same thing. Remember, we've pulled out the full reply. So I'm getting a 200. So life is good. Status is okay. Here's the value that I want. So I'm going to go through and say convert from JSON. I want just the token. I've got my token. Now I'm going to go and set my header for the session. I can now pass through. We've already shown you what the result and what the token looks like. We build our URL. Funny thing is, when you cut and paste these, it's actually even pretty quick to do it this way if you wanted to walk through. And this is the beauty part of it. I use Git in order to do version control. And also, this is why you never want credentials sitting in your files, because you're going to store them in a Git repository, and then they're accessible by everybody. Not cool. We're going to now, we've authenticated. And let's do the results. So we say VM results. And there we go. The first reply came back. So it's just a single object that we actually pulled in this particular query. And there it is. So we've got all of our content there. And now the cool thing is you can then go through and let's just use another example. So I say I wanted to get the data center object. So I'm going to set a different URL. You could ultimately make as many of these as you want. And now I'm going to do the same thing to the different URL using the session. So I'm using my token, which is still active. You see results. Now you can see that we've got a value. So this is, it is, I say, it's that easy. It's that easy because we did the work for you. What I've often found is that the struggle that people face is when they want to get started with this stuff, they say, oh boy, you know, how do I get that first token? If you use, let's say you're using another platform, like say you're using Veeam, which has the same way to be able to generate a token. Turbonomic, same way. We can send your credentials, get back a token, which normally in a browser would be held as a cookie, but you don't want to do it that way because you're not storing a cookie. So ultimately you can go get the token, store the token, and then programmatically interact from that point forward. So now let's actually go through the whole thing as one single script file because this is non-interactive. Oops. So this one, double check my name. I called it VC env auth. That's it. Now it's 1 second in order to do this. And if I had something go on and I changed my username because I wanted to try different credentials, then I could just change my environment, run my export, and then from there, go ahead and run it over and over again. This means that now you ultimately can take the results of one thing and you could build out this script. Or even better, you could call this script and, effectively treat it like a module where you're going out, doing the authentication, and then doing a second script. So you can really like compartmentalize and modularize, if that's a word. I don't know if that's a word. It's a word now. We're making that word up. Modularize how you actually do this stuff. I'm not a programmer. This is also the other thing I wanted to show you. I am not a programmer. So this is stuff that, as my friend Matt Oswald would call it, I'm a full stack overflow engineer. You can seek a lot of the stuff out, and these individual little snippets may be available. But now you know where to go. Because if you go to the Turbonomic Labs GitHub, it's right there for you all the time. And we'll make sure that I'm actually going to put a blog on this as well. And you can even search my own, my shameless plug. You can follow that guy right there. If you go to discoposse.com, I probably to this day, my most popular blogs are a lot of PowerShell blogs because it's such a very commonly used and popularized way in which to script and interact. And it's really, really cool, because now I've got the ability to use this, completely interact with any either Microsoft ecosystem natively. Look, if I loaded PowerCLI, I could interact with vCenter, but I want to do this. vCenter is the example, but this is not a vCenter PowerCLI thing. This is purely an API endpoint. So now you can interact with GitHub. You can interact with if this, then that, anything that has a RESTful API endpoint, or even just a web URL. You can go through and you can build your example using the same thing, right? So whatever the header that needs to be set, you define it, you set your authentication, you tokenize it, you convert it to base64 encoding for safety. Then from there, you just adjust these URLs. And then you can do this step by step in your own CLI, and then try it out a bunch of times. And then every time something works, you go ahead and you git commit that sucker, because now you can use git in this case where, all right, so I've created a scratch file, and it's I'm going to say git add scratch, git commit, add a message, adding scratch, super intuitive message. In this case here, I'm actually doing a straight push because I'm that person that does this. So I'm actually going to go through, I go to my PowerShell examples, and there you go, there's my scratch. It's actually an empty file at the moment, but from that point forward, I could actually, load stuff in there. So if you want to try this out yourself, you can go on here. You can actually clone the repo. Ideally, the best thing you should actually do is if you fork this, fork it to your own repository. Here's what it's going to look like. So I'm going to fork this over to my Disco Posse user because I was going right to the original URL. And then right now it's saying we've got an even branch. It shows what it's forked from. And then when I want to make a change, now I'm going to do a clone of this code. So I could clone this, work here. It's completely mine. It won't get trounced by other changes. And then what I can do is then, if I want to do update and add to the code base, then I can do so just as a pull request. So if you want to contribute code and contribute examples, we're going to store a lot more than what we've got here. But here's the first place to go. So for anything that you're looking for to help with infrastructure as code, my team, all of our team, we've got such a fantastic group of folks. And hey, guess what? Azure, you're using anything for Azure, it's out of the box support for PowerCLI. So it's really, really easy to be able to, or sorry, PowerShell, goodness gracious. So this is what you want to do. You want to move towards more programmatic methods. And in doing so, you're effectively protecting yourself from the phone call that something's going on, right? And I could go back and, like I said, go over my own blog. And to date, some of my most popular blogs have been these kinds of very simple how-to things So this is, I hope that you find this valuable. It's been a lot of fun to be able to show you how easy it can be. And if you've got a request, then fire it in there. So you can hit me up on Twitter. There you go. My DMs are open. You can, of course, reach out to me through the Turbonomic team here. It's eric.wright, eric.wright at turbonomic.com. And if you want to drop in a comment here, we're always monitoring to make sure. So thanks for the folks that have been putting in stuff on the live stream. It's always appreciated when folks are watching. So please do come on back. So this was Turbonomic Labs PowerShell in order to interact with the vCenter RESTful API. We'll do some more examples. Anything you want to kick the tires on, I'm happy to do the work so that you don't have to. That's the value of automation. And even better, it's the value of technology in a community. And I'm happy to be able to share whatever knowledge I can and save you the hard yards, because this is what I've learned throughout my career. I was lucky enough that in doing a lot of this work and publishing stuff on the blog, that I actually got to write for the Scripting Guys blog back in the day, as one would say, because Jeff Hicks and the team, they had got a great blog where they share lots of real use cases. So here's a use case, right? Authenticate into your vCenter API, and then I'll put up some more examples. So grab the repo, fork it, and you'll be good to go. And again, whether it's through GitHub as well, fire up, put it in an issue. And if you want to interact that way, we're in code world, kids. So I hope you enjoy this. And of course, make sure you come on back. Turbonomic Labs, go to turbonomic.com/labs. And if you want to be able to see more great content like this and find out what's coming up, we've got our the Tuesday that just passed before this, if you're watching it live, featured the new Apex capabilities inside Turbonomic. We talked about application extensibility. So I walked through a live session of that. We had JBD, our very own Jacob Ben David, who did an amazing session last week, walking through the cloud demo of Turbonomic. And then, of course, Thursdays, we feature things like OpenShift. You can go back and check that out. We're going to do Kubernetes. We're going to do Pure Cloud. I did the breakdown of an AWS VPC. This is just the fun stuff that is hard stuff. But it doesn't need to be hard, because somebody else can walk that line for you and show you the path. So I'm happy to do that.